Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of The Rock Experience with Mike Brunn. On this episode, I'm honored to be joined by legendary songwriter Jim Vallance. We're going to talk all about his work with Bryan Adams, Aerosmith, Kiss, and so much more. There's lots to cover in this episode. I want to thank Jim for his time. I know you guys are all going to really enjoy it. So let's jump in and let's get started. Well, today I want to welcome to my show somebody who, in my opinion, is one of the greatest songwriters of our generation. He's written songs with all these different artists that the people who watch my show love, from Bryan Adams, Ozzy Osbourne, Kiss, Alice Cooper, Aerosmith. I mean, I could go on for another hour or two, but I'm not going to do that. Please welcome to the show, Jim Vallance. How you doing, Jim?
I'm well, thank you.
Excellent. So, like I said, you've written with so many artists that I love, but take me back to your childhood. Who were you listening to? What was your musical influences growing up as a kid?
Oh gosh, well, before the age of 11, really there weren't any musical influences. I
Mhm.
wasn't, music wasn't even on my radar.
Mm.
Like my mom might have the radio on in the kitchen, and that was about it. I was into Batman comics and the New York Yankees.
All good
But
stuff.
but one Sunday night on TV when I'm 11, ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles, and that was it. I just knew right at that moment that's what I wanted to do, and gosh, it was a life altering thing to see that.
I wish I was alive at that time because everybody says that. And yeah, it definitely seemed to be a life-altering event for many people around at that time. Now, like you said, you were 11, just getting into music at that point. But at what age do you start writing your own songs? Because that wasn't necessarily
Well,
common at that time for people to be writing their own songs, right?
I mean, I started begging my parents for a drum kit or a guitar or anything, and I think they just thought I'd get over it. but but by the time I was 13, they gave in. I got a guitar for Christmas. My grandmother bought me a used drum kit, and so I was off and running and found some other guys at school who had guitars, and we formed a little band. So that was age 13. I think somewhere around the age of 14 or 15, I started trying to write songs. I think I realized that there were actually people who did that. If you check the small print, like, oh, who wrote She Loves You? Oh, Lennon McCartney. Okay. And then the Monkees, I was a big fan and saw that I didn't know who these people were, but Neil Diamond and Carole King were writing songs for them, Tommy Boyce. Um, so I got curious about that, about the behind the scenes creative process. Who was writing the songs? How were they recorded? Where were they recorded? I started reading the small print. So that was the beginning of my fascination with creativity.
Now, you've mentioned that you played the drums. Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't you also learn to play multiple different instruments, not just the drums? Is that correct?
Yeah, I can play bass, drums, guitar, piano. I can get around pretty good on any of those instruments. I'm not, Eddie Van Halen or, by any stretch, but I can play. And as a tool for songwriting, I mean, guitar and or piano is pretty much standard and necessary.
And that's what I would think, just having all of those different musical instrument backgrounds would help you as a songwriter. The drums as the rhythm in the song, guitars. I think that had to help you as a songwriter, right?
Well, yeah, when I was growing up, the conventional wisdom was learn piano and the rest will follow. I think you should learn drums first, and then you have a sense of groove and feel and rhythm, and that can really inform your musicianship and certainly your songwriting. So yeah, I'm grateful for that background in drums. Uh, Bass is also kind of a secret weapon.
Hmm.
Um, when I was writing with Bryan or sometimes with others with Aerosmith, I liked playing bass because you're kind of driving. I don't think the other musicians even realize, but if you're playing a G and they're playing a G, and then you go to a C and they're still playing a C, or still playing a G, it's like you're the one who's defining the chord progression.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
a powerful tool for songwriting.
That's it. Now I know that you did play percussion on some albums, and you play something. Did you ever play bass on any of these albums for these artists?
I'm uncredited. Let me think. Aerosmith, Deuces Are Wild.
Ooh,
I'm uncredited, but I played bass on that.
wow. All
Uh,
right. One of my favorite Aerosmith songs, actually.
oh, great, yeah. And some of the early Bryan Adams stuff. I'm playing bass, so yeah, here and there, yeah.
Okay. And why were you uncredited? I mean, sometimes I know it's just the
Well, there's a
business.
longer story. I mean, Deuces of Wild was an outtake. It was a demo. It never even got past the demo stage, um, but it was rejected from one of the early albums and then popped up a few years later. And for whatever reason, they didn't have time to go in the studio. So they just basically used the demo. Joe Perry overdubbed some guitars and Stephen finished the vocal. But the rest of it was what we had done in my basement studio with me on bass and guitar.
Interesting. I never knew
I
that.
wasn't credited. I mean, that's understandable. I mean, it's an Aerosmith record.
Right. No. And a few years ago they were doing, I think it was a Vegas residency, and they called it Deuces Are Wild. And I was like, maybe they'll start performing that song. And unfortunately it wasn't in the set list. But like I said, that's
Oh,
always been one of my favorite Aerosmith songs.
yeah, well, I mean, I love that song. But when we wrote it, the A&R guy for Geffen Records, John Kolodner, who had, a lot of creative control over the content, he said to me and Stephen, I don't like the title. And that's the second time that happened. There's another Aerosmith song called Rag Doll
Yep.
that Stephen and Joe and I wrote. And it was originally called Ragtime, like the New Orleans feel.
Yep.
And Kolodner said, I don't like the title. So we spent hours trying to find a new title. And finally, Kolodner hooked us up with Holly Knight.
Yep. I've
And
had her on my show.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And so somewhere in the song, I think there was a line called like tearing up a rag doll. And I think Holly said, well, there's your title, Rag
Right.
Doll. So, and then Kolodner liked it. But a couple of years later with Deuces Are Wild, it was a repeat where he said, I don't like the title. And Stephen and I said, well, we do. And Kolodner said, well, if you don't change the title, it's not going on the album.
Wow.
And Stephen and I stood our ground, and Kolodner won. It didn't go on the album. But a couple of years later, it was resurrected for, I think it was in a movie.
It was, yeah, was it like Bill and Ted, I think, or something like that? I think it was.
Beavis and Butthead,
Beavis,
maybe?
yeah, Beavis and Butthead,
Yeah,
yeah. One,
yeah.
one of those 90s guys. Yep. So
So again, that's where there wasn't time or whatever. Maybe they were touring, so they just used basically our demo and a
interesting.
few overdubs.
Interesting.
That's how I get my bass thing on an Aerosmith record.
That's awesome. Now, obviously, your career really took off at first writing with Bryan Adams, right? So just talk about, how did you meet Bryan Adams, and how did that partnership come about?
Well, Bryan and I both grew up in Vancouver, west coast of Canada, and well, we didn't know each other, but I knew he was in a band called Sweeney Todd, and I was in a band called Prism, both Canadian bands. And excuse me, we knew about each other, but we'd never met. And then one day we were both in a music store called Long and McQuaid, which is kind of the Canadian version of Guitar Center. And a friend introduced us, and we kind of had a little chat and exchanged phone numbers. Got together a few days later and wrote a song the first day, and the second day, and the third day, and here we are, nearly 50 years later.
Right, that's amazing. So
I know.
take me in the room of the two of you writing. What was it like typically? Was it you coming in with an idea, him coming in, or did you just like kind of brainstorm in person? Like, how did that writing sessions go usually?
I mean, different every time.
Okay.
Sometimes I would have a little snippet of melody or a few lines of lyric, just something, literally a seed of an idea. Or Bryan would come in with the same. Or
Mhm.
sometimes we literally have nothing, just walk into the room with a blank sheet of paper and
Mhm.
no ideas at all. But as long as you've got some little tiny kernel. You can kind of, stretch it and grow it and bounce ideas back and forth. And the next thing you know, in a couple of hours or sometimes a couple of days, you have a song pretty much
Sure,
written. Yeah.
sure.
But a little bit different every time.
Okay. Now, those first couple of Bryan Adams albums, I think you produced the first one, if I'm not mistaken, but they weren't big hits, right? So during that time, those first few albums, are you thinking this might not happen? Or do you still feel that confidence like, hey, this is going to happen. We're going to do this?
Well, you have to know Brian. He is unstoppable and unshakable. And right from the get-go, I just sensed that there was no stopping him. He was the only direction he acknowledged was up.
Mm.
So anytime I had any maybe crisis of confidence, Brian was there to say, no, we're carrying on. And we did. We worked really hard. So I met him in January 78. First album, had a little bit of success in Canada. Second album, a little bit better. And by the third album, which is 1983, so that's 5 years after we met,
Yeah.
finally, with all the perseverance and the hard work, and I think, learning to be better songwriters, we had a hit with the song Cuts Like a Knife. And then after that, it was pretty much just onward and upward.
Off to the races. Yeah. So what do you remember about that song, Cuts Like? I mean, I think that's an absolutely great song. What do you remember about writing that song and kind of you and Brian in a room together coming up with that?
But it's basically just the verses are just three chords that go around and around and around. I think, yeah, actually the chorus too. Yeah, it's pretty much like some of Tom Petty's songs are like that, like Free Falling, the verse and the chorus, just three chords and it keeps going. And so we were just playing these three chords, and Brian would mumble, just singing along. Steven Tyler the same, just early stages of the songwriter. There's no lyrics. You're just kind of singing.
Just do like a scat vocal over the music,
Yeah,
right?
scat. That's a good word. Yeah. So Brian was just kind of scatting, and I thought I heard him say "cuss like a knife," and I stopped. I said, "Did you just say cuss like a knife?" He says, "Yeah, I think so." I said, "Oh, but it feels so right,"
Mhm.
and there was the beginning of the song. But when we had that, it cuts like a knife, but it feels so right. The rest of the song pretty much wrote itself after that. So I mean, titles are so important.
Mhm.
If you get a good title right out of the gate, then you're off and running. So in that case, we had a good title. It just felt right, and we kept going. And I don't know how long it took. Maybe the rest of that day and the following day to kind of sew it up. But
Mhm.
that's my recollection of that one.
That's also, I'm smiling because I had Desmond Child once on the podcast, and he said almost word for word the same thing. Once you have a good title, it's then you so it's so funny that that's the way songwriters think. Like it starts with the title. I would have never thought of that as not being a songwriter myself. So,
Well, it's true. Like a song I wrote that Hart ended up doing called "What About Love." When I co-wrote that song with Brian Allen and Sharon Holton from a Canadian band, we got together one night after dinner and just we all sat there and said, "Anybody got anything? Like where do we start?" And I said, I think it's a title. I said, and it's one note. The melody is one note. And I said, John Lennon had, all you need is love, just one note. I said, well, I've got this idea. What about love? I said, that's all I got. And well, okay. And again, by the end of that evening, we'd pretty much written that song. Now, we wrote it for their band,
right.
and I think there were 20 songs and only room for 12 songs on the album. And What About Love ended up not getting voted for inclusion. So it sat on a shelf for 3 or 4 years until a guy named Don Grierson, Capitol Records, heard it and sent it to Hart. And they hated it.
Did they really?
The Wilson sisters heard it, and I think Nancy, I heard it years later. Nancy said, "I will not record that song," and she got up and walked out of the room. And Ron Nevison, the producer, said, "Look, I'll tell you what, I think it's a hit. Why don't we record it? If you still hate it, I promise it won't go on the record." And so they recorded it, and I guess they liked it. So
I guess they
ended up being a big hit for them.
cooler, smarter heads prevails at the end of the day, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
So I want to go back to so you mentioned before growing up and that moment seeing the Beatles, right? And I'm thinking of the song Cuts Like a Knife. and the ending of it with all the na na na's. So is that, I say, drawn right off of the Beatles, like Hey Jude?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's quite a history of that. So I think the Beatles were first, with Hey Jude,
Yeah.
na 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 na,
Yeah.
and there was another song, forget the name of the band. It was called Na Na Hey Hey Kiss 'Em Goodbye.
Okay.
Na 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 na
Oh
na
yeah. Mhm.
hey, hey, goodbye.
Yeah.
And then Journey, na 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 na, you know.
Yeah.
So so we kind of just tapped into that thing. Yeah, it's a thing. No, no, no.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. Very successful thing. Now, in my opinion, in my lifetime, the Bryan Adams album Reckless is, I'm going to say song for song, one of the top 20 albums of my lifetime, right?
Oh,
I just don't think there's a bad song on that. Every song, one after the other, I'm like, this is the best song. No, this is the best song. I could do an entire podcast just on that one album, probably. When you guys were writing that album, did you feel like, hey, we've got a masterpiece on our hands here? Were you feeling like good about that?
you never know. I mean, like having a hit, especially something as big as Summer '69, which over the years it's had over 1 billion streams on Spotify now.
Yeah.
So, but when we were writing it, we couldn't have imagined that. In fact, I remember with Summer '69, we rewrote it maybe 3 times. In fact, it wasn't even called Summer '69. It was called Best Days of My Life. That was the original title for the song. And the phrase Summer '69 wasn't even, well, it was maybe in the first verse once, but it wasn't our title. No significance to that line at all.
Mm.
We came back, I think 2 or 3 weeks later, and thought, maybe Best Days of My Life isn't the best title. And then we just kind of shoehorned the phrase Summer '69 into a few empty spots in the song and called it that. And then we still didn't think it was that good. We almost left it off the album.
Which is
So,
amazing because it's one of the best songs of the decade to me.
well, when I hear it now, I don't even remember what we didn't like about it.
Right?
But
Okay.
but at the time when you're being so critical, and again, this is now Brian's fourth album. We're getting better as songwriters, probably more critical, self-critical in particular, and wanting to write good songs. But you just never really know. You do there's two guys in a room. You write something that the two of you like, and then you kind of hope that everybody else likes it too.
Right.
You couldn't even begin to imagine, um, you know, success of the kind of success that song has had.
Yeah.
And if you could imagine it, and if you could plan it, I'd write a hit like that every time. But you know, there's just
True.
no way of knowing. And honestly, we didn't know. We just did the best work we were capable of at that time.
Mm.
And you put it out there and hope everybody
Hope for the
else
best,
likes it
right?
too. Yeah.
Do you remember? I know you just said it went through a couple of different rewrites. Do you remember? I know you said the song title changed. Do you remember some of the other things you didn't like about the song that you rewrote?
Well, yeah, the arrangement for one. So if you know the song, it starts with just guitar,
Yep.
just guitar and vocal. There's like a chunky guitar, gung, 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 gung. The vocal comes in, and then after a few seconds, the drums come in, and then the bass doesn't come into the chorus. So the whole thing builds from like it's kind of. I think we might have been using maybe Highway to Hell as a template, where that starts with that song starts with guitar and drums, and then the bass comes in for the chorus. But so we sort of used that. But prior to that, in the middle of Summer '69, about halfway through the song, there's a big 12-string guitar breakdown, jangly guitar thing.
Yep.
The original version started with that. So this song started with the jangly guitar and then went straight into the verse. And I can't remember at what point we decided that was maybe, that might have been a better way. And we went to the just more Spartan
Hmm.
guitar and vocal thing. And that was the third try at an arrangement. And that's
Okay.
what Brian went into the studio with. And, again, yeah, right up to that moment wasn't, I think Bob Clearmountain, the producer, was probably the one who kind of,
That's New York City for you.
New York City, yeah, yeah. We'll have the sirens in a minute. Um, Probably, Bob Clearmountain had a real song sense. Brian's producer, and he's probably the one who said, Summer '69 needs to go on the record.
Right. Right.
I
Well,
wasn't, I wasn't there. I can't speak to it, but
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad somebody decided to put it on the record. Now, help settle this for me, because to me, Summer of '69 is just a feel-good summer song. In more recent years, Bryan Adams has said it's a song about sex and sexual
I know.
positions. And what are you saying? No?
I mean, that didn't come up until 20 years after the song was
Right.
released. And I think at a concert somewhere, Brian said, this Nudge Nudge Wink Wink, this song isn't really about the summer of '69, and everybody laughed, and he got a reaction, and so he's been doing that ever since.
Right.
Read the lyrics.
Right. That's
It's about high school bands and first girlfriends, and it was about the summer of 1969.
hmm Yep. That's what I always thought. But I said, all right, who better to ask than the source himself who helped write the song?
Yeah,
So
well, Brian has a different interpretation, but I was in the room too.
yeah. Well, and it makes a good headline, right? So that's cool. Now, the song Heaven on that album was actually released originally on a movie soundtrack, right?
Yes.
And the movie soundtrack did not do well, right? Was there ever consideration of keeping Heaven off of Reckless as well?
Yeah, I mean, it was recorded 2 years before,
Right.
so it wasn't even in the same time frame that we were writing and recording those other songs. And I think it was a last minute consideration. Again, I wasn't in the studio. Brian and Bob made the record. Um, but I remember a brief meeting with me and Brian and another producer who will remain nameless to protect the innocent. But I remember him saying, that song Heaven shouldn't go on the album. It should be all rockers, no ballads. And I'm glad Brian didn't take that guy's advice.
Yep. Absolutely.
Heaven was the
Amazing.
first. It was the first single off the album, and it went to number one. And I think,
Right.
and the album went to number one as well. So I think Heaven was. Well, here we are, all these years later, going. How wrong could we have been?
Right.
You know, Heaven was a hit. Summer '69 was a hit, and in the moment, we were totally unsure about either of them, or for that matter, any of those songs.
Well,
We
it
just
amazes me. Summer of '69, if I got my memory right, I think was the fourth single from the album. So,
Yeah, but there were seven singles on the
yeah,
album. I don't
yeah,
remember which order, other than Heaven was first, but
right, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Now, the song Run to You, which I did not realize this until we were both at that drum event a couple of weeks ago, and somebody on stage said Run to You was originally written for Blue Oyster Cult. And I first thought, no, no way. And then I went home and I listened to Run to You again. And I'm listening to the beginning guitar lick, and I'm like, a little bit of Don't Fear the Reaper, a little there. So set the record straight on this. Was that really written for Blue Oyster Cult?
A lot of Don't Fear the Reaper. So
hmm
our Canadian friend Bruce Fairburn,
hmm
who produced Aerosmith and AC/DC and Yes and Bon Jovi, um, he was producing Blue Oyster Cult, and he asked me and Brian if we could write a song for them. So we had a good listen to Don't Fear the Reaper, and he and I sat there, me and Brian, for an hour or more, two guitars, nose to nose, coming up with a riff that we thought Blue Oyster Cult would love. And that's the riff for Run to You. And then we wrote the rest of the song around the riff and sent it off. And then I can't remember how long, maybe a week later, we heard they didn't like it. So then I think it got sent to 38 Special as well, and maybe one other band. It got shopped around a bit,
Mm.
and nobody wanted it. So then it was like Bob Clearmountain said, I think you should put it on the Reckless album. And I think Brian wasn't convinced either. So Brian and Bob had a conversation about that. And I
hmm
think Bob again was the guy that won the day. So it ended up on the Reckless album. So that's 1985. So I think this year, 2025, it was only a couple of months ago, I get an email out of the blue from Joe Bouchard, who was the original member of Blue Oyster Cult. He had heard my story that Blue Oyster Cult didn't like it. And he sent me an email and he said, dude, we never even heard it.
Oh,
He
wow.
said, somehow, maybe our manager heard it and turned it down. Maybe our record company turned it down. He said it never even got to the band.
Wow.
So Joe and I have since become friends.
hmm
We've bonded over this story. So I went to see him perform at the Iridium in New York a few months ago, and he and his band played Run to You that night, and then
Hmm.
the night that you and I were at the cutting room, he played
Yep.
it again.
Yep.
So ironically, Run to You is now sort of part of the Blue Oyster Cult story
That
for
is
them
awesome.
not recording.
Right. Now, I have to think, with no disrespect to Blue Oyster Cult, who's a great band, it probably wouldn't have been the hit for them that it was for Brian, just my opinion.
Again, you never
We'll
know.
never know. We will
Uh,
never know, right?
yeah.
So one of the things that I love about the Reckless album also is like it's got the softer songs like Heaven, it's got the rock songs. I don't know if you were in the room when this happened, but Tina Turner, It's Only Love. Were you there when she was doing her vocal on that? And what was it like for Tina was just coming back on her upswing at that time. So what was it like working with Tina?
I was there, and
Oh, awesome.
it was magical.
Hmm.
So Tina had not, I think maybe it had just been released or was just about to be released. What's Love Got to Do with It?
Yep.
Which took her to top of the charts and well-deserved worldwide fame. But at that moment, she was touring with Lionel Richie, opening for him, and they were coming through Vancouver. And Brian got in touch with Tina's manager and said, "What are chances, of Tina doing a duet?" The song had already been recorded with Brian's vocal featured top to bottom,
Okay.
but the second verse was there. It was, and so Tina came in very, very generously, and what a sweet woman. She was just so kind and energetic, and so she goes out in the room and she starts singing the song, and it doesn't work. It's in Brian's range, and it's too low for her. And there was a short conversation about this isn't going to work. And then I can't remember if it was Tina or Brian, but it was suggested she just take the melody up a third,
Okay.
which would be a harmony part in most cases, but solo it's like a sort of new melody. So she took it up a third, and just suddenly magic happened, and she
Wow.
just killed it.
Hmm.
So that's how that came to be.
Right, right.
I had met her, so that was 1984. I had met her in 1980 when not long after her and I had split, and she was still, um, doing McDonald's restaurant conventions
Hmm.
and those kinds of smaller gigs
Right.
to make a few bucks here and there. At that time, I was the drummer for Tom Jones, and Tom had a TV show, and Tina was one of the guests on his show. So that was the first time I had sort of met her and worked with her.
Hmm.
And then again, a few years later with Brian on the Reckless album.
Right, right. Yeah. No, and to me, the timing, like you said, was perfect because she was just about to start having her own hits again. And it really, to me, just again brought Reckless to another level, having Tina Turner on the record, you know?
Well, yeah, and then the next thing you know, she's huge
Right.
worldwide, and she invites Brian to open for her
Yeah.
on European tour. Which I mean, Brian could sell out anywhere in North America, but Europe was still a new market for him. So Tina took him along and returned the favor, and the rest is history.
Absolutely. There's so many Bryan Adams songs to me that we could be talking about, right? Just rattling off the top of my head, right? There'll Never Be Another Tonight, great song. Do I have to say the words? Great song. Somebody, great song. Heated Tonight, great song, right? Does any of them, and I could keep going on and on. Do you look back at the catalog and say, hey, this song here, or these couple of songs are my favorite, or I have the best memories of this? Does any stand out for you?
Yeah, probably. I think of a really obscure song we wrote for a South African animated children's film um, called, oh gosh, the film was called it was about a dog, Jock of the, eh, I can't remember. But the
Okay.
song we wrote was called By Your Side. And the song is from the perspective of the dog singing to his master owner. And I had a dog at the time, a golden retriever named Charlotte, who I adored. And so when we were writing the song, I just kept I kept thinking, what would Charlotte say?
Hmm.
And so for that reason, I mean, check it out. It's a really pretty song. Nobody knows it. It's so obscure,
Right.
but it's called By Your Side. So that's one of my favorites because it's really close to my heart.
Interesting. And I'll admit, I do not know that one, so I'm going to check that out as soon as
Yeah.
as soon as we finish here. Um, Now, one of the things to me, but so following up with Reckless, Bryan, you go into the studio again, start writing, and Into the Fire comes out, which is, I'm going to say a little darker, a little bit more serious than what Bryan had been doing to that point. Was that a conscious decision on the two of your part to kind of make a little bit of a left turn coming off of Reckless?
It was. I think a couple of things were in play. One, Reckless was so huge, sales wise and all that we thought, how are we going to top that? So rather than try and top it, it's like maybe try something different. And Bryan had been on tour uh, all that summer of 86, I forget, 85, 86. He'd been on tour with Peter Gabriel, Sting, U2, um, and Springsteen, all of whom write songs with, more political, meaningful lyrics,
Yeah.
deeper, you know,
Right.
deeper and sometimes darker. And so it was a conscious decision to kind of go down that road. And then I had just bought an emulator keyboard. Peter Gabriel used that liberally on his album, and so some of the sounds we were making were more synthetic and keyboard oriented, and very much consciously avoiding lyrics about boys and girls and more topical. Like there's one song called Remembrance Day about the First World War. Um, what else is on there? Native Son song about the injustices perpetrated on Native Americans by the early settlers. So, very dark and very different.
Mhm.
Um, and not as well received by Bryan's fan base as the previous album. So where Reckless sold, I think, 12 million copies, Into the Fire sold a little over 1 million. So, not a failure by
No.
any measure,
Right.
but compared to what had just happened, with the previous album, it was a bit of a disappointment. Also, during that year of working on Into the Fire, um, if you put two humans in a small room with no windows for 11 years, you know, you can start to get on each other's nerves. And that's kind of the year that Bryan and I got on each other's nerves.
Mm.
And by the end of that year, writing and recording Into the Fire, we were kind of not getting along as well as we had in previous years. And then I also had my son was born around that same time, and that changes your life in measurable ways. You start to look at the world very differently. And one day I just said to Bryan, you know what, I think I need a break, And he said, what, a week or a month? I said, maybe a couple of years,
Mm.
you know. And so we parted, and he went on, to have continued success with Mutt Lange,
Yep.
writing great records, and they did pretty much a decade like that. At which point, Bryan and I kind of reconciled, and I jumped back in again, and we continued where we'd left off. But yeah, after Into the Fire, that was kind of a breaking point, and I think a natural one too. We'd taken it as far as we could as a creative team.
Now help me because maybe my memory is off here, Jim. So don't you have some co-writes though on the follow-up album?
I think they were songs that were already in progress.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Right. So those weren't songs that you were writing specifically for his follow-up album. What is it? Waking Up the Neighbors. Those are songs that
yeah,
you guys had already started. Then I guess it sounds like he finished them
yeah.
without you. Is that
But
accurate?
yeah, me and Bryan started them and Mutt finished them. Yeah,
Okay.
a good question. Yeah, so the
Okay.
chronology is like, yeah, those are songs that were still kind of just hanging around.
And when you heard those songs that I guess were finished without you, were you satisfied or were you like, hey, what happened to my song here?
Oh no, Mutt's brilliant. Come
Yeah.
on, Mutt can do no wrong. Yeah, so he elevated them. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, are there any Bryan Adams hit songs or any songs on his catalog that people would be surprised that maybe it's 80, 90% a Jim Vallance song and Bryan Adams' name might be on there because he wrote a couple of lines, but this is really a Jim Vallance song?
I think it was pretty 50-50
Okay.
all along the way.
Hmm.
Bryan and I were collaborators by any definition. Sometimes I would I would write half a song,
Hmm.
like come in with half a song,
Okay.
and Bryan would finish it. But I can't think of, maybe the only song ever that I had maybe a bit more might have been the Tina Turner one.
Okay.
It's Only Love. I might have had a bit more, but other than that, it was so 50-50,
Right.
everything. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, to me, I remember where your name and Bryan Adams' name came on my radar first, because I was the guy that always read the credits on albums, right? And I just saw the names Adams, Vallance, and I didn't know, forgive me, I didn't know who either of you guys were, but it was the Kiss album, Creatures of the Night, and the song War Machine. Now, through the years, we've all heard Gene Simmons, and look, I love Kiss, but Gene's been known to get a lot of facts wrong. So I'll just say that. Gene said that he wrote that riff on a synthesizer. Um, what's the truth, Jim? Tell us, because I don't believe always what Gene says.
And my memory is vague on it as well.
Okay.
So that was um, that was 1982.
Yeah.
So again, Brian and I started in 78, struggled until 83. So this is before Cuts Like a Knife.
Yeah.
So we're still, working our buns off, but haven't had anything, concrete to show for it yet. And one day, my phone rings at my house. Back in the days when there really was a phone,
Mhm.
and my wife picks it up. Hello, she goes, Jim, it's Michael Jackson. I go, hello,
Mhm.
hello. This is Michael James Jackson.
Just one little subtle difference there.
Yeah, yeah, Canadian record producer
Yeah.
who, because he was Canadian, me and Brian must have been on his radar, because otherwise Brian and I hadn't really made any significant waves yet. But Michael knew about us, and he said, would you guys be interested in writing a song for Kiss? And I was like, yeah, of course we would. So we wrote two songs, War Machine and Rock and Roll Hell. Now, Rock and Roll Hell was a pre-existing song that I'd written in 1979 on my own for Bachman Turner Overdrive, BTO. But Brian kept the chorus and rewrote the verse. And it was then a new song, and we presented that to Kiss. And then War Machine, I wish, honestly, if I did remember, I'd tell you what really
Mhm.
happened. But I think there was a riff. Gene, I think, came up with the riff and may have sent it to Brian. And then I heard it secondhand, so that's why I'm a bit foggy on it.
Okay.
But that was the beginning of the song, dun, 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 dun. That was the riff.
Mhm.
So I can't shed any more light on it than that. But
Okay.
we started with that riff and wrote the song. Now we finished the song and Rock and Roll Hell also, and we sent them both down to Los Angeles. And then again, the phone rings, and it's on speakerphone, so I answer, and it's Gene Simmons, who we'd never met. And we're having a little chat. Gene says, I've got the songs. I really, really like them. Rock and Roll Hell is great. He said, there's just one thing. He said, it needs a third verse. So he's on speakerphone, and Brian and I look at each other across the room. I go, well,
No, it doesn't.
actually, it's finished. It doesn't need a third verse. Gene says, you don't understand. It needs a third verse, and I'm going to write it. So it became clear to us. And in his defense, no argument. If you want a song on a Kiss album, it's got to have a Kiss member in the writing credits. Now, he wrote a third verse and did not take an unfair percentage. So I'm good with all of it.
Okay.
Both songs went on the album. And to my surprise, apparently War Machine, right up to the most recent tour, I never saw them live, but apparently it was still figured prominently in their set list.
It was. It was a staple for them for decades, pretty much.
Yeah.
And I always love giving my friends silly trivia. I'm like, because most Kiss fans say that War Machine is one of the heaviest Kiss songs. And I'm always like, and do you know that was written by the team that wrote all of Bryan Adams songs like Heaven and all those ballads? And they look at me like, really? And like the heaviest Kiss song is written with Bryan Adams and his team? I'm like, yes, that is who wrote the song. So but I will be honest, that was my introduction to Bryan Adams because again, always reading the credits, I had to know who's this, Adams and who's this Vallance guy. And then I found out, well, Bryan Adams has some albums. And I went out and I bought Cuts Like a Knife, which was the newest Bryan Adams album, simply because your name was on a Kiss album, right? And
Well,
then I
great.
buy the album and I see Don't Leave Me Lonely, Eric Carr. I'm like, whoa, wait a second. This is almost like a lost Kiss song in my mind at 13 years
Yeah.
old. What do you remember about that song, Don't Leave Me Lonely?
Well, I wasn't part of it. Where was I? Do I have a?
Yeah, I think you have a writing on that.
Well, there. That shows you how much I remember.
Well, then that answers my question.
I know Brian went down to L.A.
Uh-huh.
and wrote with Eric. Yeah, I remember now. He came back, and the song was, maybe half or three quarters complete. My recollection is again a little foggy. This is,
Hmm.
82. It's like how long ago was that? Like
Sure.
yeah.
40 plus years ago.
Yeah. So I guess I helped finish that one. I don't have a
Okay.
lot of memory of it.
Okay. Fair enough.
Mostly Brian and Eric's song, to be honest.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Now you mentioned Rock and Roll Hell and how it was originally recorded by BTO. Did you have a preference to the Kiss version or the BTO preference?
Oh, I think the BTO one was better. I
Okay.
mean, yeah, Brian's involvement definitely. Like I wrote the first one on my own,
Yep.
and Brian jumping in and contributing, I think really made it a better song.
Awesome. Now we were talking a little bit about Aerosmith before, right? So how did you come to work with Aerosmith and get involved with them?
Again, Bruce Fairburn,
Right.
a
Okay.
Canadian producer.
Yep.
Bruce and I have known each other. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but we knew each other since we were 19 and 20 years old. So we went way back. We were in the band together in Canada.
Right.
And then Bruce went on to, bigger things, one like Bon Jovi and AC/DC, as we were saying earlier.
Yep.
So he was, John Kalodner hired Bruce to produce Permanent Vacation. And Bruce very generously brought me in. I think, again, Kalodner had some control. I mean, Aerosmith had a couple of albums that hadn't done very well. And
Right.
they'd also had a couple of years of discord. Stephen and Joe weren't getting along. Drugs was a big deal.
Mhm.
And so I know there was a new manager, Tim Collins, and a new record company, Geffen. And there was an agreement. It was everybody goes to rehab, everybody gets straight and sober, and then we go in and make a record. And also, by the way, there's going to be some outside songwriters, which was Desmond Child and myself. So the day I met Stephen and Joe, Bruce Fairburn brought them over to my home studio, which was in my house. I'd never met them before. I'm a big Aerosmith fan, and suddenly I'm like have Steven Tyler and Joe Perry
Mhm.
in my house, and it was a little intimidating, but I mean super nice guys. There was maybe ever so slightly an air of we don't want to be writing with outside writers, but literally, this was about lunchtime. Bruce said, "Okay, guys, I'll come back around dinner time. I hope you have something to play for me." And he left. So there I am alone with Stephen and Joe.
Mhm.
And we got to it pretty quick. The usual, like I said before, it's like every songwriting session is very similar. You just sit down and say, anybody got anything?
Mhm.
And Joe had a riff. Dun, 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 dun. It just went
Mhm.
round and round. It didn't go anywhere. But it was a nice riff. And he said, that's all I got. And so I said to Joe, okay, keep playing that. So he just kept playing it over and over. And like I said earlier, I picked up my bass and the riff was just A, never changed. So I played a bar of A, a bar of C, a bar of G, and back to A. And it took that riff on a little journey. And Stephen perked up and started scatting, kind of mimicking Joe's melody. And honest to God, by the time Bruce Fairburn got back at dinner time, we had maybe half to three quarters of ragtime
Mhm.
written.
Wow.
And I think the next day, Stephen and I wrote the lyrics at the picnic table in my backyard and then presented it to John Kalodner. Back in those days, there was no email. So we would put it on a cassette and FedEx it down to LA on it.
Right, right, right.
And so the next day, Kalodner would get it. And then he called and said, I even remember his voice, I don't like the title.
Oh man. Now, I picked up on something you said before, and I'm thinking of it again right now. How you had to put things on cassettes back then, right? And I noticed when you were talking about the Kiss songs, you said you and Brian finished them and then sent them to Gene. As a big music lover, I have to ask you, do you still have all of those tapes?
Probably most of them. Yeah.
Okay.
I kept pretty much everything. A few things have disappeared over the years, but I mean, I had one. Let me tell you a little side story.
Yeah.
So Aerosmith. So I wrote 12 songs that got recorded back in the late 80s, early 90s. They recorded 12 things we wrote. And then there were maybe another 5 or 6 things we wrote that ended up on the shelf, as
Okay.
songs often do. So 30 years later, there's music fans out there who know way more about our music than we do, even,
Hmm.
you know. And I get an email from this guy, Gonzalez in Argentina, and he says, congratulations, uh, the song Legendary Child, which nobody is supposed to know about. It was just a demo that never even got beyond,
Hmm.
my basement studio. Somehow Gonzalez knew about it. Congratulations, it's being released. Aerosmith had recorded it. And I went,
Hmm.
oh, great.
Hmm.
So I checked into it and discovered that I had not been credited. It was written by Steven Tyler and Joe Perry,
Hmm.
which is wrong. It was a three-way co-write.
Right.
So I got in touch with their manager, Trudy Green, and told her that they had neglected to credit me, and she said, "Well, you never wrote it." I said, "Yeah, yes, I did." She
Hmm.
said, "Well, prove it." So I went down in my basement and went through boxes from however many 20 or 30 years ago,
Hmm.
found the cassette of the demo we had recorded, with a couple of different versions, as the song went from beginning to finished song.
Hmm.
And then now we do have the internet, so I transcribed the cassette to an MP3, emailed it down, and Trudy goes, "Okay, yeah." And then I got a very sweet phone call from Stephen apologizing,
Okay.
um, for the oversight, and I did get my credit.
All right. So
So yes,
it's
I do. I
probably
do.
on his side. It was just, I'm going to say, it sounds like a 30-year fog of memory that who remembers what you did 30 years ago? You're too busy living it.
Totally, yeah,
Okay.
forgivable, and
Right.
it was corrected. Yeah.
Right. Now, I love the story, and we were talking about this when I saw you a few weeks ago about the song The Other Side, right? Because so I've read this on your website, but for those who haven't read your website, first off, shame on all of them. Go to jimvallance.com. There's a bunch of great things on there. I told you I got lost on your website for hours reading, right? But I love the story about the song The Other Side. So just share that with everybody who's watching and listening.
Well, that was one Christmas holiday, sort of between Christmas and New Year, and I was working with Aerosmith in and around that time, and I just got really inspired. I was sort of channeling Stephen in my mind, and some of our shared influences like the Stones and Zeppelin, and I just started playing the guitar and came up with this idea and worked on it over the holidays. Laid it down in my home studio with guitar, bass, and drums, and put it on a cassette and sent it to Stephen in Boston. And this was winter. Stephen likes to walk. He's a walker, but in the winter he uses a treadmill. So he has a treadmill in his house. So as I heard later, he got the cassette, popped it into his player, put the headphones on, and went for a walk on his treadmill and started singing along. So I didn't have any melody on it. It was just guitar, bass, and drums, just the track. And I think after that walk, Stephen had pretty much sketched out the melody and maybe some of the lyrics, for the other side. And so he puts it on a cassette with a vocal, sends it back to me. I put it on my machine and I play it and I go, no, he got it wrong. He's singing a verse over the chorus and he's singing a chorus over the verse. He heard the song differently than I did. And so I phoned him and said, nice work, but you got it backwards. It's wrong. He says, it's not wrong. Listen again. And you know what? He was right. It was way better.
Wow. In that moment when you first get it and you're thinking he got it wrong, are you upset as the one who wrote all the music?
Yeah, I just thought, oh, what a shame, you know.
Right,
But honestly, I mean, it just shows you just don't always know.
right. And
Yeah,
that is, I mean, the song starts with the chorus. The first lyrics you hear is the chorus. So
yeah,
in your mind, that was where the verse was going to be starting.
exactly. Yep.
Right,
Yeah.
fascinating. When I first read that story, I went back and played the song probably half a dozen times that night, and I'm like, with no disrespect to him, like, I think Steve got it right. I think he got it. So I'm happy to hear that you say that also, that
Yeah.
you think in
I,
hindsight, you got it right.
I think on my website there might be just the track with no vocal. I
Yeah,
can't,
I think there is. Yeah.
if not, I'll send it to you. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'd love that. Definitely. Definitely. Now, you as a songwriter, right? So when you're working with Bryan Adams, you're building his career. So there's not a template of what Bryan Adams has to do. You're creating that template, as opposed to when you're working with Aerosmith. And like you said, you were already an Aerosmith fan. They've got 10 years behind them at that point, roughly, give or take. Um, do you approach songwriting differently when you're coming into a pre-existing band like that?
No, there's no difference at all. You just, never once in my whole career have I ever gone into a room and said, today, let's write a really bad song. You
Right. Of course not. Right.
Regardless of the circumstances, whether it's Brian on his way up or Aerosmith already at the top of their game,
Mhm.
or gosh, one great example is if you know the Canadian band Glass Tiger, we had
Yeah.
a big hit with a song called
Don't
"Don't
forget
Forget
you
Me."
when I'm gone. Mhm.
Yeah, they were a garage band. They'd never made a record.
Yeah.
They were teenagers from a little town north of Toronto, and this was their first time in a recording studio, first time of anything. And right out of the gate, it went to the top of the charts. So again, whether it's a teenage garage band or Aerosmith with already a decade or so under their belt, it's just all about writing the best song you can for that circumstance. And the only thing that changes is, as an extreme example, I mean, there might be one week where I wrote a song for, Michael Bublé, and the next week for Ozzy Osbourne. So you change gears,
Right.
but it's still music. It's still just what's the best song for Michael Bublé? What's the best song for Ozzy?
Hmm.
And some of the lyric considerations are gonna shift as well.
Yep. Yep.
But
Yep.
it's all songwriting is just songwriting 101. It just changes ever so slightly from artist to artist.
That's awesome. I'm so glad you just brought up Ozzy, right? Because again, I was the guy that read the credits all the time, and I'd see your name all through the 80s and the 90s on different albums. And here it is, I buy an Ozzy album, and there's your name again. I'm like, are you? And that one surprised me a little bit because always the bands that I knew about that you were associated with had a little bit of a pop sensibility to it, if you will, a little bit, like you just said, "Don't Forget Me When I'm Gone." I knew that song. I have the 45 sitting in my closet over here. And then I see Ozzy Osbourne, "I Just Want You," and your name on there. So what was it like for you working with Ozzy? I mean, is he as crazy as everybody says he is? What was it like for you?
He's the loveliest man. He
Hmm.
is so sweet, generous, thoughtful, funny, so funny.
Hmm.
So it was joyful. I enjoyed every minute with Ozzy. He's really smart, really talented, knows exactly who he is, what he's doing, who his fans are, all of it. Very, very focused. So yeah, I loved my time with Ozzy.
And what do you remember about that song, "I Just Want You"? Because I happen to think that's another great one.
Well, the full story is on my website, but we had so much fun with that song. Um, I have to try to remember some of the lyrics. There are no,
There are no one's capable of. There are no one. Right,
yeah,
there's
yeah.
always like that. Mhm.
It's always these couples. No,
I just want you, right?
unclosable doors, unwinnable wars. There's all these rhyming couplets. So
Yep.
I think we wrote 50 of them,
Hmm.
you know, and we just started going off the edge. There are no unflushable turds. There are no awards. I mean, none of it got used, but we
Right.
we just had so many laughs writing that
Mhm.
song.
Mhm.
And out of the 50 we came up ideas we came up with, we chose the best, whatever, 8 or 10.
Right.
Yeah,
And you'll correct me if I'm wrong with this. I'm trying to go off my memory when I was reading through your website. That was also that the music of that was Beatles influence for you as well, right? Am I right in saying
yeah.
that?
Well,
Mhm.
Ozzy's the biggest Beatle fan in the
Yeah.
world. Or maybe
Mhm.
second biggest after me. I'm not sure, but
Okay.
we're both. In fact, there's a song that we wrote, very poppy, very Beatley, that I would have loved to have gone on one of his albums, but his wife Sharon thought it was too Beatles for Ozzy.
Hmm.
I still have the demo and I love it. Um, I don't think it'll ever see the light of day. But it was me and Ozzy totally channeled our
Really.
Beatle thing, and had fun doing that as well.
See, hearing that, and then the comment, like you said, probably never see the light of day breaks my heart because as a music fan, like those are the kind of things I love to hear, which is another thing I love about your website is you do give little snippets of some of these things. So again, anybody who's watching or listening, check out the website. You'll get lost on there for days like I did. So you know, another song that comes to mind right away, Lita Ford, Shot of Poison, right?
Yeah,
So that's
yeah.
another to me, just great. I call it pop rock, but I don't mean that in a negative way because I happen to love, it's got a good melody, good hook. What do you remember about that song?
Again, Lita was just a joy to spend time with. So talented, so nice, and um, I think we were just trying to write a single, you
Hmm,
know.
it worked.
Yeah. So I enjoyed the session. I don't have a lot of memory. I think the lyrics, I didn't participate so much in the lyrics as I did in the band track and
Okay.
melody. I think she finished it with maybe Myron Grombacher, maybe.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. She took what we
Who was
started.
the drummer for Pat Benatar?
Yeah, she
Yep.
took it to LA and finished it with him. So
Hmm.
I don't have any memory of the lyric bit, but
Okay.
had a week with her and just had a really good time.
Right. Now, I could go on for days talking about all the great songs that you've written, right? But do you ever sit at home and does it ever bother you that, hey, Bryan Adams is a household name, Ozzy Osbourne's a household name, Jim Vallance is not a household name? Or are you like, I kind of like that I could kind of walk the streets of Manhattan and not get bombarded by people?
Well, yeah, I've had a front row seat to celebrity for 50 years, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. I
Agreed.
mean, they have no privacy, no life to speak of. Maybe there's a bit of a thrill walking down the street and being recognized, but I'm going to think after a while it gets a little old. So no, I'm very grateful for my anonymity, grateful for the career and the people I've spent time with, all of them wonderful. But
Mhm.
no, I wouldn't trade my anonymity for anything.
Yeah, I personally I agree. And just to make sure you do get the proper recognition. In 2022, you and Bryan Adams were inducted in Canada into the Songwriters Hall of Fame together, right? So you do get that recognition. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this year he's nominated in the American Songwriters Hall of Fame, but I don't recall seeing your name there. And I instantly was like, why not? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, he has a huge catalog independent of me. He's written with, Elliot Kennedy and Mutt Lang and, many, many others. So that's his honor.
Okay, well, I think you're being very nice there because, and I love Bryan Adams and I love his catalog. I love some of his newest stuff. The classic stuff is the ones with your name on it, but I said that, not you. So, and I will continue to say that. So I think you're just being a gentleman and very nice about that. So, you deserve it as well as him.
Well, that's kind. Thank you.
Yes. So, we're coming up now, what, 50 years, 40, 50 years of you writing songs or whatever. And I think these songs are going to be played another 50 or 100 years. As you look forward and you say, like my kids and their kids, what songs do you want to be most remembered for?
Well, maybe Summer '69
Hmm.
because, it's, songwriting, a lot of it's like writing fictional short stories. You just, you draw upon some personal experiences, but for the most part, you're writing little mini screenplays.
Yeah.
You Summer '69 is maybe one of the only songs in my catalog where I drew a lot from my personal, my teen years, my first bands,
Hmm.
first girlfriends, that sort of thing. So I have some fondness for that song. Had it been a hit or not, it would still be the song that I think is maybe closest to my heart.
Hmm. That's understandable. And on your website, I'm going to give you another plug here. You go through that song line by line and what each line represents and what the names and who the people are, the names of the people in the song. So, I mean, that's the kind of stuff you should write a book, in my opinion, right? So, have you ever thought of that?
I think my website is my book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And definitely people should check that out. So is there anything else, Jim, before we wrap up here that you say, you know what, Mike, how come you didn't ask me about this? I want the fans out there to know about this.
No, I think you've covered it, and you've challenged me. You've made me think about things I hadn't thought about for many years, and
Okay.
hopefully I remembered some of it.
I think you did a great job. Look, I always say this when I'm interviewing people. I will sit there and I'll read about it because that's what I do. You lived it. And you aren't sitting there worrying about, oh, hey, I'm sitting in a room and I'm writing the song somebody, and let me document exactly how this is going right now because you were busy living that moment, not documenting it. It's people like me who love to hear all the minutia. And like I said, I could do an entire episode just talking about Reckless because every song on that, she's only happy when she's dancing. It's what a freaking great album. So, but I appreciate all the stories.
I heard a great story once. I can't remember from who, but apparently someone approached George Harrison once and said, I have a bootleg of you guys rehearsing. Would you like me to make you a copy? He says, I don't need to hear it. I was there.
Right. So you were talking about those tapes in your basement, and instantly I'm like, oh my God, I would love to sit in there and hear all of those. And you're like, probably never listen to them because you're like, I lived it. I'm good. So, but maybe some of those tapes one day could show up on like a Reckless 40th anniversary special or something like that. So make sure you're taking good care of them, please.
They are. I know where they are.
Awesome. Well, Jim, again, I want to thank you for your time. This has been an absolute honor for me. I love your work for decades. You've, helped kind of shape the music I've listened to for my entire life. So I'll just say thank you so much.
Very kind. Thank you.
Yes. Alrighty. There you have it. Once again, I'd like to thank Jim for being very generous with his time and sharing so many great stories about the songs and the artists that he worked with over the years. Thanks so much, Jim. For everybody watching and listening, if you enjoyed hearing Jim's stories as much as I did, I really strongly recommend you check out his website, jimvallance.com, where you'll be able to read so many more great stories about the songs and the artists that he worked with. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button below. If you're listening to one of my podcasts, subscribe over there as well. Also, head on over to Facebook and follow my page, The Rock Experience with Mike Brunn, where each and every day we talk about all the rock and roll music that you love. You could also follow me on Instagram and Twitter as well. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you all next time.